Hello everyone, what is up? I am Rob.
I am Eamon.
And this is Monster Fuzz. Very special episode today.
Extremely special.
We've just finished recording with the one, the only Brother Richard. And boy, what an episode
It's
it is.
a good one. It's actually a really good one.
Probably my favourite episode, actually.
Yeah, I think it's when you finish it and you feel so sort of you
G'd
have more
up.
questions. Like we did about an hour of kind of questions and Brother Richard explaining various things to us. And at the end of it, you're like, I could do 4 more hours of this.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't feel like anything.
No, yeah.
So such a what I will say, such an articulate, intelligent, interesting character. Like there's
Absolutely.
very few other people that I think are as interesting to listen to them talk.
Yeah, it was really good. Like, we would have went on talking all night only for I told Brother Richard beforehand that we'd have an hour of his time. But really and truly, if we had the opportunity, we would have just kept talking. Really weird, and it will be on the video, but we were talking about demonic entities, and part of this one paneling fell off the wall as we were talking about it, which is...
Now, to be fair, it did look like it was going to go, but why did it go at that moment?
Yeah.
You know?
So that was kind of creepy.
Do you think, though, because I'm thinking about that now, the probability was that it would fall at a certain point, but I wonder, was there a tiny little energy being generated by our conversations that, like...
I only noticed it before we started recording, and I pressed on it and it felt sturdy. I was like, oh yeah, that's grand. And just sat down.
What happens? This
literally
thing will start looking at us and all.
I literally said to you before we started, I was like, that's fine.
Yeah.
So, we won't take too much of your time. We're not going to plug our usual Patreon stuff. If you want to support the Capuchin Society, there'll be a link in the episode notes on YouTube and on Spotify and Apple Podcasts everywhere. And head on over. Brother Richard explains that towards the end of the episode, but that's the work that they do is really important and really cool. And it's super valuable to the people of wherever they do it. I think they do it in probably different places everywhere they are.
Yeah, I know the particular area in like Church Street, he was saying, in Dublin, but like you were saying, he's all sort of all over the place.
Exactly. So check out that link in the description. Give it a support. And also Brother Richard mentioned his upcoming book, so that'll probably be releasing at the end of next week. So it'll be actually this week that you're listening to this podcast episode. It'll be releasing, I think,
on the 12th.
Yeah.
Said,
so go out and get Brother Richard's book. Check it out.
We certainly will be getting.
Absolutely.
Book. Yeah.
So head on out, check that out, and enjoy the interview, folks.
It's great. It's really good.
Brother Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here.
Yeah, man, it's been a long time coming. We were saying before we started recording, we bumped into you there at the live show. It was great seeing you there, of course, but it's been a long time coming on the pod. We've actually referenced you a few times because we have these questions sometimes when we're talking about ghosts, we're talking about maybe religious stuff. And it's nice to finally have someone who can illuminate us from an actual proper perspective, I suppose. On it.
It's funny. It's funny to be chatting to you now in this capacity, because the first time I actually heard you, I believe, was during lockdown. You did a monastic view of the other. I think there was 2 parts with Tim in Strange
That's right.
Familiars.
That was with Tim Renner on Strange Familiars. Yeah. That was my first kind of jump into this kind of podcast world. It was a strange one, because where that came from was, I mean, all of your fans know Strange Familiars and Tim, and I've been listening to his stuff for quite a while, from the time he was on Where Did the Road Go, etc., and really enjoyed his stuff. And I came across a few bits and pieces of folklore that were pursuant to some of the work he was doing. I just sent it to him, and then it became a kind of an email conversation back and forth. And then he invited me on, and I've been back and forth kind of regularly there ever since. We've become good friends.
It was fascinating for me, because I had listened to some of Tim's stuff before, and I think I was taking, like, it was I believe it was during lockdown, and I was taking a stroll in the middle of the night, because it was I was
the way we all did.
So bored, but I was walking through a forest, and I remember vividly you guys were talking about gifting and the forest. And, be careful what you're messing with and all this. And just this terrible heebie-jeebie feeling coming over me as I became vulnerable. But I think that you have a very calming voice. My mother actually listened to it, and she commented on how you have the nicest Irish voice she's heard. So that maybe kept me calm when I was in the forest.
Well, I'm glad we got you home safe. Yes. You weren't taken away by the by the good people. That's okay. Yeah.
How did you find the podcast, and when you first jumped into it? Like, did you find it? Were you comfortable behind the mic, or did you find it a bit awkward? Did you like it?
Well, I've done a lot of kind of radio work and interview work over the years. So in fact, at one stage there was a kind of a religious music program that very occasionally I dropped in to kind of host way back local radio stuff. Cool. They would have us in occasionally when they wanted to. Well, generally it was when the other host just didn't turn up, to be honest. But there'd be a sudden panic, to get somebody in. But so over the years there's been that, and then I worked ever before this kind of end of things. I did a lot of work with the Dublin Gospel Choir, and so I was their kind of announcer, MC, kind of speaking between the songs, the music, that kind of stuff. So, the broadcast stuff has been there as a kind of a background element all the way through. But the podcast stuff just took off. I think it was an unusual, at the time, it was unusual for, I suppose, people in the kind of paranormal podcast world to suddenly have a voice coming in from this particular tradition. So a lot of people were very interested. And I mean, after those first two with Tim particularly, I was inundated with questions.
I'm not surprised, because it was so interesting.
Yeah, it was.
I would have listened to that before, I got to know Tim. Tim is such a lovely guy as well, and he's been so good to us.
Yeah, great guy. Yeah.
But it was so interesting that when I found out there was a part 2, I was, I'm never excited for anything, but I was so excited to listen to the next part. I found it totally fascinating. And then I think I listened to the next one you did on relics as well, and just really, really interesting stuff. And
well, that was really, because that came out of Tim talking about the fact that the more he studied the Bigfoot phenomena where evidence was concerned, the more he was seeing sort of parallels with the relic tradition. And so it kind of, sort of sparked a few bits and pieces with me, and we put together a show on that. And that was really interesting, because I think for a lot of people who tend to live a very compartmentalized view of reality, paranormal is in one room, and religion and faith might be in another room, and history and science is in another room, or whatever it might be, to actually begin to see that as human beings, we have kind of common ways of structuring reality. And even though we might have a different label on the door, it's amazing how often we tend to repeat the same things over and over again. And especially when you're dealing with, the broadest definition of the supernatural, you tend to find these parallels between these things, often much to the annoyance of the investigator. But it is interesting and I think when you have a broad view and a broad kind of understanding of these traditions, often it can shed light on stuff that's happening in one area in a way that you otherwise wouldn't find that kind of information.
Yeah, the one thing that I found, not the one thing, many things I found very interesting, but one of the things that stood out to me was that you might go into listening to that kind of a theme, let's say a religious view of a particular phenomenon, thinking that it might be quite dogmatic or restricted. But what I found when I listened to that was actually there was this really vivid openness that your discipline had, which not that I didn't expect. I suppose I didn't really know what to expect, but I was struck by how open and maybe curious is a good word. Is that a fair word to say? Open,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that's, I belong to the Franciscan tradition within Catholicism, and I suppose that would be a kind of a core element which of that sort of tradition, which coming from St. Francis of Assisi, has that idea that you encounter everyone, doesn't matter whether they're human or some other element, but you encounter everyone as, number one, from a position of respect, number two, as with the idea that you're encountering kind of one of the family, it's a brother or sister in that sense. And so rather than me, wading in to tell people where they're all going wrong, which often can be the kind of the sort of projected vision that people often have. Really, it's about actually listening and discovering, well, where's the wisdom in the room, and sometimes that might be a little piece of wisdom I can offer, and very often it's wisdom that I receive from others or from the other traditions as well. So wherever, my job is to kind of, seek for truth, and wherever that truth is, then it's okay, and that often comes in surprising directions. So from that kind of point of view, I think it's a more open way to approach these things. And very often, especially when you're dealing with some of the kind of cases that we deal with from time to time, coming in with that sort of an attitude often diffuses a lot of the emotion and fear and irritation or worry or stress that people can be under in those situations. And that can often be by itself just enough to actually diffuse the situation completely.
Yeah.
So because sometimes, as we know, I mean, anybody in this area knows that psychological stress and anxiety can often ramp up what's happening for people, and people don't realize just how much they're actually feeding the experience themselves sometimes.
Yeah. And so do you mind me asking how often would you get kind of requests from people, or maybe people who are struggling with some sort of
it's intermittent, but certainly either myself or somebody else in the community here, we live as a community of 11, would, about once a month or so you'd be dealing with stuff,
and it would be kind of nationally or more so you're
nationally,
Dublin,
nationally, people tend to find us, and I suppose one of the kind of funny things about it is that, I mean, I'd want to be really clear, like people would turn up with stuff happening, and in 90% of cases, you discover that it's either psychological or a combination of issues maybe happening that might stem from the very practical, there's noise in the roof, we think it's a ghost, and it turns out to be mice.
Right.
Right the way through to the person who's actually having, serious or real manifestation. And then, so a lot of the period, a lot of the initial encounters are really about telling the story, hearing what's going on, seeing, applying kind of a diagnosis. There's this sort of, I think there's a TV series to be made out there of the equivalent of Dr. House and his diagnosis of the paranormal, because it does, and often turns out to be a combination of factors. People have these very simple narratives from media, from TV and movies and all of that kind of stuff. Often it turns out to be a very complicated narrative, and the paranormal might only be one small thread in the midst of a lot of human chaos.
Right. So before we get into the nitty gritty, and the conversation's definitely going that way, for our listeners and for my own ignorance, what's the difference between a priest and a brother in your sense?
Okay, so I'm a friar.
A friar.
A friar, and nothing to do with cooking. One of our brothers was once asked what he was, and he said he was a friar, and the person looked blankly at them and said, Burger King or McDonald's? So friar as in, exactly, F-R-I-A-R. So that's a form of monastic life within the Catholic tradition, whereby we are essentially monks who are not bound to an individual monastery.
Right.
So if you go to the older orders like the Benedictines or the Cistercians, they vow to a particular monastery. They don't move around from that monastery. Most of the time, if you want to meet one of those monks, you have to kind of go and visit them at the monastery. Right. The friars were began by St. Francis of Assisi in the early 1200s as a kind of a renewal of monastic life. And our idea is, well, actually, the whole world is our monastery. We have various places that we live, and we move quite often. So the value of detachment is a very important element for us. So while we live in one place for a couple of years, we're always sort of on the move, always kind of changing where we live. And while you might have a community that's living in one place for many years, that the place I'm living in now, we've had a community here since the early 1600s.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wow.
But the friars themselves shift and change all of the time. So the longest you'd be in one place is 6 years.
Oh,
normally change every year.
What brought you to? What was the kind of the experience of joining the friars?
So I suppose I got to about 16 or so, coming up to the end of kind of second level education. My plan at the time was to head for the sciences. I was had a huge interest in zoology, so I was going to do a broad biology and then specialize in zoology. That was the plan. at the same time, I suppose I was always one of those people who was kind of asking the uncomfortable questions in school that, what's it all about really? Kind of question, all of that sort of stuff. That led me to read very, very widely, as well as, now, I mean, we came from a Catholic family in the sense that, it was an ordinary practicing family of the 80s. So it was more, there was a lot of socialized Catholicism to it, as well as actual faith as well. But there was certainly no pressure on me in terms of vocation or anything like that. So around about that time, somebody, and this is the strange bit, this is my little paranormal bit, I do not remember to this day who gave me the book. But somebody gave me a book on the life of St. Francis, and it kind of lay there in a pile of books for a long time. And eventually I picked it up and read it, and it was like, it just ignited a bit of a spark, because for the first time I saw the kind of unitive vision of ecology and creation and all of that sort of stuff, which I would have espoused from the kind of scientific point of view, blending with, here's someone who's asking the big questions and who pursues meditation, contemplation, the gospel life, the Catholic life. But this was the big kicker for me, was St. Francis stresses joy more than anything else. The Franciscan mission is about joy. And, you don't tend to see a lot of joy, sadly, in religion as such. So those two things really kind of fascinated me, and I kept thinking about it. And eventually I sort of said, God, I wonder, do these guys still exist? I didn't know. I'd never met a friar before. So I did what we all did in the pre-internet days. I pulled out the phone book and I looked up Franciscans, and I discovered that the Capuchins, which is the branch that I joined, the Franciscan order is one of the biggest orders in the world and has many different branches. But the Capuchins were the ones I was interested in, because they tried to live the life of St. Francis as the original brothers did.
Okay.
And I just phoned, actually, the community I'm in here now, Church Street in Dublin city centre. I phoned them and I spoke to one of the brothers there and said, look, I was interested in having a chat. And he said, well, come in anytime. And just before he put the phone down, he said to me, how old are you? And I said, I'm 16. He said, okay, well, if you're coming, your parents come with you. Okay. So I said, okay. So folks came in. We met with a couple of the brothers and they said, look, you're too young. Obviously, you're way too young at the moment. But what we ask you to do is just, if it's okay with your parents, drop in once a month, give us a hand with some of the work that we're doing here, because we have a big kitchen for the homeless here that we still run. And that's what I used to do. I'd come in, I'd meet the brothers, I'd have a chat with them, see how things were going. Did the leaving cert, got my place in college. Then it was a case of, okay, little bit of a choice to be made. And at the time, the big decision was, is it going to be college first while thinking about this and really feeling the draw of it? Or is it try this first and get it out of the way?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I went to two different priests that I knew who weren't anything to do with the order. And one of them said, do the college first. And the other fellow said, no, get this out of the way. So I was exactly where I was. And then I just kind of logicked it through and said, look, if I'm doing the college thing and the college experience, I don't want this hanging over me.
Yeah.
I want to get this out of the way first. So I tried. I went to them and they thankfully took me in for the first year. And I mean, like, it's a long training. It's 11 years
all right.
of training. So for the first 3 years, there's no commitment. You can pretty much leave first 2 years, you can leave at any stage that you want. Mm-hmm. After that, you take a commitment to stay, but on a yearly basis for a number of years until you're 8 years in. And then after 8 years, you take your vows for life. So that's what I did. And with all of the ups and downs and joys and sorrows and tragedies and moments of crises and all the rest of it that humanity has, I'm still here 30-something years after. So
it's been 30-something years.
1992, I entered.
Did you get an uptick of people joining when Star Wars Episode 1 came out and Qui-Gon Jinn was walking?
No, but I think the dark side probably did. Yeah. No. I mean, it is. People laugh about the Jedi thing, and I mean, I did have that wonderful experience. Both my brothers are involved in the comic industry, you know, and I remember calling into one of the Comic Cons to meet one of my brothers. Two very funny things happened. The first was, it's the first time walking in the robes that nobody blinked an eye. That's the first thing. I felt I'm back being anonymous again. It was fantastic. And the second thing that happened was one of the artists who worked with, he did the Irish one, The Secret of Kells and Wolf Walkers and a few of the
Reanimation.
The Song of the Sea and that. I mean, I love that artwork. Absolutely love it. So I bought one of the books and went up to get him to sign it. And he was chuffed because he thought for the first time he had a cosplay guy up in one of the costumes. So I had to disillusion him and say, no, actually, you've a real one in front of you. So, he was happy with that.
That's funny. So because I was always enamored with monks, because we on my school route every day, like I used to walk. I used to live really close to the friary here in Wexford. So I used to walk past there almost every day, and you see the monks in their robes. Are they Capuchin as well?
No, so they're another branch of the order. Yeah, they're conventual. So again, it's a complicated family tree, a bit of a thorn bush, really, in terms of how it all works. But we would all, we all work with each other. Still, we would just stress different elements of the kind of the tradition at different times. Yeah,
cool. Is there ever much debate amongst you, or is it kind of?
Well, the old joke used to be if you put 3 Franciscans in a room for long enough, you get 2 orders. Because again, Francis would have been very free in terms of the kind of individuality, the expression of the life. So like the individual gifts are encouraged, and fellas are encouraged to pursue individual interests in that way as well.
Is it fair to say this is something that this is a question that we've brought up on the podcast quite a few times, and it just kind of happens organically as we're thinking about it? Like, did ghosts in the paranormal, would that have been was the first mentioned in religious scriptures, or was it a thing where maybe, like, was there folklore beforehand? Is the Holy Ghost the first mention of a ghost?
No. And I think the two things are parallel. If you go back to the old, if you're just going to talk Christian tradition for a minute, like all of the traditions, like there is no religious tradition that doesn't have some teaching around the dead or the spirits of the dead or the souls of the dead. Like, it goes right the way back, and I would say it's probably one of these ubiquitous phenomena that's back to the very beginning of just humanity, you know?
Right, okay.
As soon as somebody could light a fire in a cave and saw shadows on the back wall, people were terrifying each other with stories, you know? So I think that's the first thing. But in terms of the Christian tradition or Judeo-Christian tradition, it goes right the way back to the Old Testament. And one of the first appearances of a de facto ghost is the ghost of the King Saul is brought back from the dead by a witch. Sorry, I'm getting it wrong. The prophet is brought back. The ghost of a prophet, Samuel, is brought back by King Saul by the witch of Endor. Oh. So you have a ghost and a seance within the Old Testament. Wow. Within the New Testament, you have a number of times where Christ works various miracles, like walking on the water or walking towards the sort of some of the nature-defying miracles. And the disciples, their first go-to is, it's a ghost. And even after the resurrection, we have a teaching from Jesus about ghosts, which is they see him after the resurrection and they're wondering, is it a ghost? And he says, no, it's not a ghost. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones. A ghost doesn't eat. So again, by reference, by sort of by looking at what he's saying there, the early Christian tradition was very clear that ghosts were a thing. They are around. We speak as well of, there's a differentiation as well within a kind of a technical one within the Christian tradition, differentiation between a spirit and a ghost. So a ghost is a human. In that sense, in the fullest sense, it's a human soul that kind of comes back from the dead for whatever reason. We can go into those reasons afterwards. Whereas all of us have a spirit. We are a living spirit, a living soul that is unified with the body into what we call a human being. So in the Christian tradition, the body and the soul are two halves of one being. We do not view it as most people tend to have this picture in their head of, oh, I have a body and there's like a ghost inside me, and when the body dies, the ghost sort of floats off. The Christian metaphysical tradition actually is very clear that the body is equally part of you, a part of your human identity, as is the soul. And so the fullness of redemption and all of those kind of things only takes place at the very end of time, when the body, in some form, we do not know what form it will be in, but in some form, at least the energy of the body, let's call it that way, will be reunited with the soul, and we will experience the totality of ourselves again.
Okay, so is it almost, we've talked previously on the podcast, we've done some kind of indigenous folklore, and we've referenced a few times that they don't differentiate between the corporeal and the metaphysical in the same way that we do in kind of Western society now.
Well, that we do in Western society since about 1700. Right. That's one of the things people forget about, is that actually the view was pretty much the same across all of the kind of the traditions, now expressed differently, and obviously with sometimes very different metaphysic understandings of what was going on. But it's really only with the so-called Enlightenment of the 1700s that you have this cutting of sort of soul and body being two very different things.
Yeah.
So right the way through, and we still find it in folklore as well as in religion as well, the understanding is that the body affects the spirit, the soul, and vice versa. And that in fact we can have, spiritual effect on one another through what we do with the body, not just physical effect for another.
Yeah, and is this connected? Because I know, you kind of pick up information. You can never be sure if it's sort of correct or not. But I remember someone saying to me, or I read this or some way, it's in my head for some reason, that when, I think it was Descartes was looking at the body and trying to understand how it worked, there was discussions with the church, and they said, well, you can look at the body and you can sort of, find out the mechanisms of how the body works, but the soul belongs to us. And they said that was where the split, I don't know if that's part of it.
I think that's a kind of a sort of a parable of what happened really in his own writings. So there was never a kind of a statement of you go over there and we'll go over here. It just sort of de facto happened as schools of philosophy kind of wanted to step back. And it's part of that whole wave of revolution that took place right the way across Europe, as things like monarchy and divine monarchy and all of that sort of stuff was sort of put behind us. So alongside that then was this whole thing of we'll only accept, what we can prove by logic and with the five senses rather than what has been handed down by tradition. And so a lot of babies were thrown out with a lot of bathwater, and it's interesting that right the way now, when we begin to look at sort of what the very cutting edge of physics and the cutting edge of neurobiology is talking about, now we're back at, consciousness and energy as the two foundations of everything that exists. So from that point of view, there's kind of been a circling round. So I often find when I read some of the scientific literature now, and also some of an awful lot of the paranormal literature now, that often what you're finding is a new vocabulary for very old concepts. And so, because people compartmentalize science and religion, you end up in a situation where people are having to kind of reinvent the wheel without actually knowing that a lot of these systems, these things were already systematized, It
happens as well with us, because you're right, as we do on our mini fuzzes, we'll talk about, we'll throw in usually a couple of maybe science articles where we're talking about, reanimation or something to do with that kind of side of things. And then it always seems to converge and go together again with the folklore and the spiritual side of things. And you're you're probably right in that. It's funny.
It's one human understanding. And I think that's the thing. So I'm not saying, I'm really not saying, people, I'm not here saying, the Enlightenment shouldn't have taken place, or, we should go back to the way we were in the Middle Ages, or anything like that. Not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that people, at the very least, what I'm saying is people need to read far more widely than they do now. And one of the things that we do within our tradition, I suppose, because of the long training, because of the long work, all of us have trained in not just people kind of think you enter the monastery and nobody whispers a word of anything except the kind of the sacred texts of our tradition. Whereas an awful lot of the work that we do is actually studying all of the traditions, in huge depth, and also the sciences. So you end up coming out with a very kind of a rounded, and not in a combative way. It's not like, here's how they're wrong, so we can prove ourselves. It's more about actually understanding where teaching and tradition have come from. And then, as I say, when you've got individual interest as well in this area, you tend to come across these things. So I think if modern physics was to sit down with, a folklorist, an exorcist, and a kind of someone who's coming at it from maybe the nature mysticism point of view, a lot of that conversation might be in different terms, but they're going to find that they're referring to pretty much the same subjects, the same matter, really.
Yeah, really interesting. There's, funny enough, you say that we've covered a lot of near-death experiences and outer body experiences at the kind of point of death, or and then
sure.
People may be sort of, what would you say, legally or scientifically dead, but they have these very strange experiences, which are, from what I've read, the vast majority seem to be a really beautiful, life-affirming experience, which is actually quite nice to read about.
Yeah.
And I suppose from what you're saying there, it's almost as if, you're circling back. We're trying to understand this, that this, I don't want to say science, but it's starting as anecdote again.
But everything does. Yeah. Everything does start as anecdote, and that's the problem. We have this idea that there's some kind of refined, pure space of science, and that just doesn't exist. Everything starts with a human being looking at something and going, why? Mm-hmm. And then having to explore various stories. Because in the end, we express all our knowledge narratively. I can't remember who it was, but some great anthropologist said we should never have called ourselves Homo sapiens. Why is humanity humankind? We should have called ourselves Homo narrans, which is storytelling humanity.
Yeah. That's very true.
Because even the more they explore from a neurobiological point of view, the more they understand that the human brain is actually oriented towards story primarily. And story is how we it's how we pass on knowledge. There's a wonderful article by an anthropologist about one of the oldest ceremonial burials ever found. I think it goes back to Neanderthal times. The Shanidar burial. And it was the first time that they discovered an older person who had suffered life-threatening injuries that had obviously been cared for and healed, and then buried ceremonially. And this was a big thing for them because it shows culture, but it also shows, the question was, when you're really worried that you're going to starve or be eaten by something any day, why do you look after an old cripple? What's the practical survival reason for looking after an old cripple? And the only thing they could say was, this was the storyteller.
The knowledge, yeah.
This was the person who had the knowledge of what happened years ago and where the berries were now, and don't eat that, you won't like that, or watch out from behind that rock, or whatever it might be. So we begin to construct our reality based on the storyteller primarily. And the storyteller is able to give, the question of meaning to us more than anything else, because even if you look at all of the great religious traditions, every one of them began with a figure who told stories. And that's how we tend to accept ontological truth more readily than just, here's a fact. If there's a story to go with it, think of the teachers who taught yourselves. When you get together to talk about your school days, you don't tend to talk about what they taught you. You'll talk about how they taught you. True. And the stories that were associated with them. And the ones who could tell the best stories, they were the ones that taught you.
Yeah, it's funny, because it's funny you say that. Myself and Rob would probably both reference the same history teacher, the way he taught us when we were in school. To your point,
absolutely. So when we can actually recognize that, the scientist also has to tell a story, and it might be a very different story to the one that the monk is telling, for example, but both of them in their own way are seeking meaning. Both of them are trying to answer fundamental questions. When science is doing its job best, it's answering the question what and how. When religion is doing its best job, it's answering the question, or trying to answer the question, why. The problem becomes when both of those fields try and step into each other's footsteps, and that's when it becomes difficult. That's when you have a Galileo moment, when religion gets it wrong, and it's when you get a Dawkins moment when science gets it wrong.
Is there room for Eamon just referenced there the NDEs and stuff like that, near-death experiences. Like, is there room for that within, say, your interpretation? Like, if you heard a near-death experience,
Absolutely.
how would you take that? Like, would you be it could be a profound religious experience?
Sure, and I think what you have to do is to recognize that it could be, like, I have to begin from if someone tells me this story, I have to begin honestly from a I don't know perspective.
Yeah.
So after that point, I can turn around and say to them, look, if a scientist in the morning proves that these experiences are the dying of neurons, and imagery that's generated by memory or whatever in the midst of that, if they can prove that and do so in a repeatable way according to the scientific method, then that's fine. It doesn't take anything from my religion, because in that sense, we call them near-death experiences for a reason. They don't die. So we're not actually knowing what happens after death from that point of view.
Do you ever find it? No, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if somebody turns around and says to me, this is parallel to our religious tradition, or this actually, I think this proves Buddhism because I think I was reincarnated, or whatever it might be, I sit and listen to that, and I can understand the truth of the wisdom from it, and I can then offer, well, this is how my tradition would answer that. But it has to be in a dialogic form whereby both of us go away, hopefully a little bit more inspired or interested. Like I worked for a number of years as a hospital chaplain, and I've been present when people have come back.
Okay.
Present when people have said, "Oh, I saw." I've been present in deathbeds where people are obviously seeing, or at least, from a scientific point of view, having the experience of seeing.
Oh, wow.
Things beyond them and all of that. And I'd one beautiful one, talk about folklore and the wisdom of folklore, where a gentleman who died very sadly, very suddenly, and he died, he was gone, but it was an extremely sudden death. And they called me in, the family called me in to say some prayers over the body. The family went outside, and there was a lovely, not old, but reasonably mature nurse from down the country, a good Kerry lady. She said to me, "Do you mind if we clean up around you while you're saying the prayers, because we need to get this room ready?" And I said, no problem. I mean, the man was dead. He wasn't going to get deader, So I was saying the prayers, and they were kind of responding as they were doing their thing. There was 3 nurses there, and as part of the prayers for the recently deceased, you actually say to the person, "You have died." And it's a very important moment, because if the spirit is still abiding by the body, they need to hear, they need to be told. And as I was saying these particular prayers, there was a big chest of drawers of surgical equipment beside me, and the whole thing just started shaking. It was shaking. So I just went on with prayers anyway. But the nurse leaned over from behind me and said, "Sorry for a moment, Father." And she gave the corpse a slap on the backside and said, "Lie down, you're dead." And it all stopped dead. Whoa. And she looked at me and she said, "Father, sometimes they have to be told." I said, "Oh, that was it." So there's an awful lot goes on that people have absolutely no idea of, particularly in places like that. And I mean, I could tell you stories like that for the rest of the evening.
But, and did that enhance? Like, is there experiences like that maybe enhanced your faith or added to it a little bit, and confirmed it a bit more? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a kind of a confirmation, maybe. But from that point of view, I mean, I would just see it as an interesting event, and it's part and parcel of it. And I made sure whenever I was doing the prayers over the dead in future to say very clearly to them, "You have died," and you can go now, basically.
And it's almost
because
as if that nurse,
particularly where there's accidental or sudden death, you can't.
It's funny because it's almost as if the nurse knew in some way, right? Like, she was like, "Oh yeah, this is," like you were saying, that the person who told the story or who knew which berries to eat, she was almost part of that.
Yeah,
is
exactly.
It ever, I was going to say, is it ever difficult, like, to? I suppose it seems like you're very open to all kind of possibilities, as you said there about, if science proves such and such a thing, that's fine. Is it ever difficult to be in that sort of in-between area? Did it ever feel like that on your journey where...
No, I think for me, if you're going to be a monk, you're in the in-between all of the time. Right. Like you're dwelling with people in very privileged experiences, but you're with them at birth, you're with them at death, you're with them when they're in the extreme of suffering, you're with them at their, on their wedding day, the best day of their life, hopefully. I think it was Garrison Keillor said about wedding days, that's when people live happily ever after for 6 months. But it's a really important role, and it's a very liminal role. And in the paranormal, we often talk about liminality and threshold being really important in terms of when these things manifest. So as a result, we tend to be witnesses to an awful lot of unusual things. And after a while, it's not that the extraordinary becomes ordinary. You just begin to recognize that the extraordinary is actually the background music of human life.
That's a great
So when you're talking to human beings, every one of them will say, not at all, don't believe in any of that, not at all, it doesn't happen. And then as you talk on, and then we Tim talks about this in Strange Familiars, the longer you talk with people, and especially the more you kind of prompt them, because there is definitely a kind of a paranormal amnesia that a lot of people go through. But as they're kind of, sort of have their memories jogged, you'll suddenly find, when I was 10, this strangest thing happened. Yeah. Or, there was that drive we went on where, the road was weird and we came back down from the mountains and I've no idea how we got where we got, or, there's all of those things. Everybody has them. I have yet to meet a human being who doesn't have them.
A lot of people might forget them when they drive through in a Scotty.
Well, that's a whole other dimension. But it's an interesting thing, and essentially because of the role we're in, people can feel very comfortable telling us those stories,
right?
Or asking for advice around that. So the longer I have been in working with this tradition and living it as best I can, and we start again every day. I want to be very clear, like I'm no master or guru or saint or anything like that at all. I'm just someone who's trying my best each day. But it's one of the great privileges is people share these stories with us. And they want to. And I think also there is an Irish thing as well. It's very interesting. I don't know if you saw it. There was a very good documentary on traveller culture in Ireland. It's probably still up on the RTE player, called Minker.
Okay.
And one of the things they talked about was how paranormal stories get passed down. And in the traveller culture, the way they spoke about it on this documentary was, if your great grandmother had the event happen to you, and she was your great grandmother, you could tell it as though it happened to you. Because the story belonged to the blood. Okay? And I think there's a lot of that in Ireland, not just amongst the traveller population. I think, and it's not that people are lying or embroidering or anything else, but I do think there are a lot of familial stories that get passed down.
That is true.
We're back to the storyteller again, and it's sort of, do you remember that story that Granny used to tell her, that Uncle Mike used to tell, or whatever it might be, and it'll get told again, and it mightn't be exactly the way Uncle Mike told it, but it'll be told, and the bones of it will remain.
That's it is true. I suppose it's a good prompt to ask you yourself if you had any sort of spooky encounters, if you had anything that is giving you the willies, so to speak.
Well, I suppose from the darker end of things, I'll start at the beginning. So, I mean, all of us are sort of involved in this world, but some of us seem to just get drawn into it further. And I was drawn into this by one of our brothers who's now gone to God, a wonderful man. Brother Robert was his name. And he was a theologian, he was a teacher, he was all of those kind of things, with excellent professor and a great pastor. But this was a side of his life he was called to. So there was one evening we were sitting as students, and he suddenly saw the clock and he said, "Oh, I have to go up and go out." And it was 8 o'clock in the evening or whatever. And one of us said, "Where are you off to?" And he said, "Ghost busting." And he'd walked out the door. And we were kind of like, what are you talking about? So when he came back, we were interested to ask. And he said, no, you get called into it from time to time. He was assessing a case. And that's why he was going out in the evening, because these manifestations happened at this particular house in the evening. So as time went on, occasionally he would kind of take me aside and sort of fill me in on bits and pieces. And he knew that there was some bit there of not just of interest, but that it was something I was kind of, I suppose, had some kind of a connection to. There's a familial connection as well. We have a family line going back in my mother's line, a good few generations back, who were kind of healers and things like that. So there was a bit of an element there with that. So he just, for whatever reason, kind of centered on me. And as a result, he would either refer things to me to do initial assessments on, and then if it was serious, I'd go and get him.
Oh, okay.
Or he would kind of take me out or advise me on different things. So I never really had manifestations as such. You go to houses, you bless them, you talk to people, you kind of say, well, I have no idea what's really going on here. But the one that kind of really started it for me was a couple they'd moved into a new big house, beautiful big house out in Clontarf. And as you know, those houses, even when this is 15 years ago, 20 years ago, if you were buying them, even then you were doing okay. And they'd a son and a daughter. The son was quite young. And from the time they moved to the house, the son just wouldn't settle. And they put it down to, the whole new house and getting used to a big house and all of that. But the child just would not settle in his room at all. And then after a while, he began to talk about the black thing. He was only a small kid, so he didn't have, the vocabulary to kind of describe it. It was all about the black thing. The black thing was in my room last night, the black thing. So they did a few things, and they brought, people in who were kind of spiritual. I'm not sure whether they were psychic or mediums or whatever. Anyway, they all said that they had a really bad feeling in the place, and they gave them a few things to do, which they didn't sort anything out. And eventually Granny was brought in, and Granny said, go and get yourselves a monk.
Okay. Wise of Granny.
Well, she was worried about the grandchild. So we went down, two of us. We generally, if we're doing a house, two of us will go. So one asks questions and does the dialogue with the family, and the other one just sits there as a receiver, just to see what we're picking up. So I was asking the questions. The other guy was the receiver, and we were sitting in the front room chatting. We blessed the house, went around the house, blessed it. There was no bad feeling, nothing weird, nothing strange. Little fellow was sitting on a beanbag watching the television, absolutely happy as Larry, middle of the day, loads of people around. And then the brother who was with me, who was the kind of receiver, gave me a nudge and said, look over. And the kid had gone white and rigid and was staring at the corner of the room. So we went over and I said to him, what's here? And he said, it's here. It's in the room. Now, we couldn't see it, but we walked over to the corner, and the corner was absolutely freezing cold, like totally weird in comparison to the rest of the nice, warm, central heated house, So it had come down in the corner of the room. So he had watched it roll down from the ceiling, this kind of black amorphous mass. And we realized his room was actually the room upstairs. And that was the room that he wouldn't go into for love nor money. Mm-hmm. So there are kind of initial prayers and blessings. So we said we'd do that, but we wanted to make sure that he was involved with it, because it's really important where children are concerned that they feel they have kind of power over it, that they're able to kind of defeat it themselves. So we gave him things to do, and we told him to blow into the corner, counted 3 and blow into Meanwhile, we're doing our own stuff, our own work. So he did that and gave a big happy birthday blow, the spit everywhere. It was more raspberry than... And it retreated, and we followed it up into the next room, and the room was freezing cold, the bedroom, and it retreated up into the attic. So I asked the couple, had they been in the attic yet, and they hadn't been. So anyway, I told them, look, get the kids out of the house for a day and go up to the attic and see what's around. And we gave them some supplies to kind of sprinkle around and, to sort of begin to clear out the attic. And if need be, we'd come back. So when they got to the attic was locked. They had to break through the door to get in. And when they got up there, the attic area over the kids' room was filled with children's clothes and children's toys and all of that kind of stuff, which they found very weird because they had bought the house from an elderly person who didn't seem to have any family or no mention of family or whatever. So they asked me, what should they do with the stuff? I said, get rid of it all. Don't give it away. Don't give it away to any kind of, secondhand or whatever. Just, get rid of it. So they cleared all that stuff out, and then we went and we cleared the clearing blessings on the house again. From that day on, they never had another manifestation. It was gone. So a couple of months later, the man of the house was walking down the street and met one of the old neighbours from the area. He said, "Oh, you've moved into so-and-so," and, the usual weather talk, welcome to the neighbourhood, etc. So he asked him, he said, like, "We didn't know anybody who was in there before." And your man anyway basically told the story of that. Strange, there was a very strange family there. And it turned out that they picked up over time that there was possibly some kind of abusive stuff going on within the house. Now, I don't know what level of abuse, don't know what it was, but it had left something there. And we had cleared that out. And from then on, really, it's been a case of sometimes you find good stuff. Sometimes, I mean, if somebody tells me, Granny's appearing at the end of the bed, like the first question is, well, what's she doing? Is she just being Granny? In which case, there's no need to move anything. Say a prayer for Granny and listen to her if she's giving you advice. But if it's a case of, something dark and something causing problem or bringing fear or anxiety or depression, and oftentimes, if it's negative, that's the kind of route it will take. The person loses energy, the person becomes quite sickly, the family will become irritable, they start fighting with each other more than families usually do. Intimate relationships, will fall apart. And what you find is that there's a kind of a parasitic draw of just the good away. And very often people find themselves isolating more and more. And then you're into a kind of a spiral of negativity that can happen. And if that's mixed with things like you'll find it can be mixed with, it can cause mental illness. It can be mixed with a mental illness. It can certainly manifest where there's a lot of addiction, especially if there's drug addiction, that kind of stuff. It's like our immune system becomes weaker for these kind of things when we're involved in that sort of stuff. So oftentimes when we would go in, it's as much about counseling people and making sure that they're getting the supports to mind themselves as it is about asking something to move on. And oftentimes you'd have to ask someone to do like not just a kind of an addiction inventory or a mental health inventory, but also a spiritual inventory. Like, are you living a compassionate life? Are you living, a life that's actually seeking meaning? Are you, whatever your spiritual tradition is, are you trying to live according to that? Because they're the things that actually kind of boost the immune system from a spirituality point of view.
Yeah, and so would it be fair to say that we talked kind of about liminal spaces before, and we'd cover a lot of stuff, the haunted hotel. I think the Stanley Hotel maybe is a good example. That's a tragedy there. Is it possible then if something, that quite bad happened in a place, or in fact the opposite, if there was maybe a glorious sort of occasion in a place, that it can create a kind of positive or a negative atmosphere? And then,
absolutely.
And can that create sort of like what you described there, the black, it almost seemed like, would that have been, how am I saying this? And I might be using the wrong verbiage here completely, but is that kind of like an entity, a thing? It has a kind of a presence? I
mean, it certainly seemed to have agency, put it like that. So again, we have broad categories that we work from. There's about 10 categories that we would work from where we come into a haunting, and often a mixture of them. So like someone says to me, there's a ghost in my house, okay, and we've ruled out the mice and the heating pipes and all of that kind of stuff, and there's actual what we call preternatural stuff going on. So stuff is moving by itself, or there's cold spots, or there's the bed is being shaken at night, or whatever it might be. So when we go in there, the various categories we would work through, if it's not kind of a saint or an angel, if it's not good, if it's not appearing in a good way, then what you can have is what we would call a full-on apparition of a purgatorial soul or a holy soul. And from that point of view, we mean someone who has died. It's a human being who has died. It's an entity in the sense that it is the same human, same personality, etc., as when they were alive. We would believe from our Christian tradition that they're moving through a state of spiritual purification. And as a result, they're allowed to contact people to seek prayer or to seek help, spiritual help or assistance. It's considered so important that from the Catholic tradition, we dedicate an entire month every year to praying for them and making spiritual offerings for them. And that's the month of November. So very much in the sort of Celtic tradition, Samhain would have led into that, you know, and the idea was during that time, that sort of thinner time, they are more able to manifest and to seek help. So if you were talking to your great granny years ago and you know, she thought that there was a kind of some kind of a manifestation going on, normally the first thing they would have done would be to have prayers said for the dead, particularly to have the mass celebrated for the dead, or they would do a pilgrimage for them, or they'd light candles for them or whatever, and that was to assist them along the way. The next kind of state you would have is what you're talking about with the Stanley Hotel, and that's what we would call a clairvoyant vision of a past event. So now you don't have a soul present. So if you try and talk to these apparitions or have communication with them, they're not going to communicate with you. They may be annoyed or unsettled that you are there, but they won't actually have communication with you. And this is where somebody's own sensitivity tunes in, and for whatever reason, maybe an emotional resonance, sometimes a genetic resonance or whatever, they will begin to see manifestations of things that happened there, particularly if there were extremes of emotion, negative or positive. So, for example, in Ireland, we have the proverb Cuimhnean an Tír na Manaigh, that the land remembers the monks. And that goes back to the idea that when the Reformation happened and the monasteries were destroyed and Cromwell came and all of that, the people would still go to the monasteries for healing. They'd go, you know, to the ruins. They'd take the earth from the monasteries and that kind of stuff. And their idea was that because there'd been a community there for so long in some of the Celtic monasteries over 1,000 years, you know, praying and meditating and doing good, that there was goodness in the bones of the place. And similarly, you know, if you had a place where there were murders or where there was, sort of tragic events or whatever, then you'd be told, number one, to avoid the place, and number two, never to bring anything home from that place, because you were kind of communicating, you were bringing the stuff in that had that resonance. And if somebody was attuned enough, they could pick up from that. So in those experiences, if people see individuals, generally the ghost as such, in such experiences, isn't sentient and doesn't communicate. Okay. Mm-hmm. Then you're into poltergeist stuff. And we would say that there are 3 types of poltergeist. And very often the manifestations are kind of the same. The first kind would be a range of kind of psychic or psychokinetic phenomena, and that's associated with living human beings who are in high emotional stress states. So this is where you get the sudden or recurrent PK experience. Often adolescents, tends to be portrayed as usually female adolescents, but it's 50-50. And very often the poor kids have no idea they're doing it themselves. So they end up terrifying themselves, and you get this generative circle that keeps going. And then the second type of poltergeist is where you would get either a manifestation of a purgatorial soul seeking recognition and prayer, and causing things to happen so as to seek that out, but they don't have the ability to manifest or to be seen fully yet. And then you'd have the third stage, which is where you've got something demonic, which is just doing stuff to cause chaos.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what would be, is there a sort of a gauge in which you'd be like, yeah, this is like the devil?
The only, I mean, put it like this, if you take 100 cases of real hauntings and stuff like that, the actual full-on demonic end of things is about 1% of that.
Okay, right.
So, don't listen to Hollywood. Don't believe the movies. It's very, very rare. That's now, I mean, obviously from my tradition and from the work that I do, I would say the demonic is very real, and it's like anything. If you start paying attention to it, it will start paying attention to you. And often what people don't realize is that it is masterly manipulative. And so can use people. So someone, for example, starts having spontaneous poltergeist effects, and the family begin to become terrified and scared, and they don't realize that it's some poor individual or some poor kid who, for whatever reason, these energies are unleashed for a while. Generally, if it's a human poltergeist end of things, 6 months and it runs out of steam and it's gone. Okay. If it's longer than that, we would kind of look into it, because now it's being generated. And what you can have is attachment at that point of view. Again, the child, the young person, is totally unwilling. They do not know that something is attached to them, but something has attached, and it's now using them as a focus. And that attachment needs to be broken at that point.
Is there any famous cases where you would associate it and say that case was some kind of demonic, direct demonic kind of influence or something like that?
The famous one that comes to mind is the actual case that inspired the original movie of The Exorcist, which was a genuine case that took place in, I think it was New Orleans. It was a boy, not a girl, who was possessed. But that began with kind of poltergeist-like problems in the house. And again, I would say what you probably had was an adolescent who was going through a lot of experience, a lot of difficulty, probably a lot of repression. Oftentimes, repression
just fell off the wall as we were talking there. That has totally spooked the shit out of me.
Yeah,
I'm part of my French.
When you get a lot of that stuff going on, then you end up having kind of a connected end of things. But I'm aware of that case very, very deeply. It's one of the ones that's kind of studied very, very clearly. No doubts that was full on diabolical in its full sense. Having said that, the movie was based on it, the movie is based on it, but there's three major things wrong with the movie. The first is it is extremely rare to get kind of extreme supernatural elements happening all the way through a case like that. The devil doesn't want to be seen, doesn't want you to know that it's active, a demonic spirit is active there. So it doesn't show its hand until it's absolutely forced to show its hand. The second element is that, the clergy coming into it are not fearful, and they don't think they're going to die or going to lose because of it. If someone is coming in from a place of kind of faith, the most important thing is that we're not coming in from an ego place. It's not about me as an individual or as a human being. You come in with the authority of the tradition, and it's in that authority that anything is achieved. It's never about the person. From that point of view, that's a really important thing. And the third thing around it is that oftentimes this takes a long time. It can be a kind of an eviction. It's very seldom that an eviction happens in one fell swoop. Normally, there's kind of like mopping up operations that have to take place over a couple of months afterwards. And I think the other thing that people need to be aware of when it comes to talking about exorcism and stuff like that is that an exorcism is only performed ever. A full exorcism is only performed ever after all of the physical, mental, psychological, and psychiatric possible causes have been ruled out. Mm-hmm. So if you're called into a place where somebody thinks an individual is actually possessed, you are not allowed by church law to perform an exorcism until a psychiatrist and a psychologist have signed off that there is no way that what's going on is human in origin.
Ah, that's interesting. Yeah, because that is a question that pops up sometimes on the podcast. Because obviously, a lot of the exorcism cases obviously involve religious figureheads, and you're trying to figure out how it's handled. You're like, is it just that the people go first, or
Yeah, the normal thing for an exorcism is generally if a person turns up and says, "I think I need to be exorcised," like 99.9%, absolutely no, they don't, mm-hmm. Because again, if a thing actually has assumed some level of control, it's not going to bring the person to be exorcised. Okay. Mm-hmm. Usually what you find is that it's family members who have exhausted everything else, mm-hmm. and are now saying, this person, there's something else going on here. It's not just physical or mental or emotional problems. At that point, then nothing is done. We don't start off with, we might give the person a blessing just like we'd bless anybody, but nothing happens in terms of that. But there are various diagnostic tests that are done. Once the psychologist and psychiatrist have evaluated the person and said, actually, no, it's not, multiple personality disorder, or it's not schizophrenia, it's not something induced by drug psychosis or something like that. All of that stuff has has to be cleared before you would even begin. And an exorcism is never performed without a medical person in the room with them at all times, to make sure that the individual isn't either pushed past, physical circumstances that they can't sustain, or that the person isn't actually doing psychological damage to them by the exorcism. It's a very important thing to safeguard the people who are there involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. I know with sort of the demonic end of things, and this will tie it a little bit in with the kind of cryptid stuff, I suppose. We talked previously about, the most popular cryptids. Usually you have Bigfoot and Mothman and your usual heavy hitters, but someone who's been coming up the ranks recently is the Dogman, a kind of werewolf type guy. There's a lot of stories that I've heard, at least when we're doing various bits of research for the show, where the Dogman seems to be this kind of stalking entity that people say is kind of that there's an aura of evil, like just evil about it.
And I've never come across one, put it like that, but I did correspond with the famous Linda Godfrey.
Nice.
Some Lord of Mercy on her now, but some years ago. And that was because I had read her original book on the Beast of Bray Road, and something twigged in the back of my head, and I was like, hang on a second, I remember some. And I went digging in our archives, and we have there's a very famous work called the Flores Seraphicum, which is the lives of the early Capuchins. It goes back to the 1500s. And in one of them, there was a brother who was a renowned exorcist, and there's some illustrations of him doing his work. And the demon that he's exorcising looks, to all intents and purposes, like a dogman.
Oh.
So I took photographs of that and I'll send you them on. And I sent it on to Linda Godfrey. And what's really interesting is the creature as depicted is three-toed, as well as the hot legs, the whole thing. So she was fascinated to discover that this, it always goes older. You'll always discover, actually the previous generation did, but they called it this or they called it that. It's always the way back. So I'm putting my zoological head on for a moment, way that an animal exactly. That it doesn't work biologically. That's the worst thing. Whatever about the big ape. Okay, we can talk about that another show. But the so as far as I'm concerned, whatever people are seeing, I think there's an awful lot of kind of elemental nature stuff that's around that people don't really realize is actually there. And especially when you're dealing with somewhere like where an awful lot of these cases seem to appear is the United States. And an awful lot of the indigenous lore has been lost because of the persecution and destruction of those poor people. You end up in a situation maybe where people are disturbing things that they don't understand what they're disturbing, and they don't know what they're dealing with. That's true. So I think it's no wonder it's angry and has an aura of evil about it or whatever, if it's wondering what these usurpers are doing on its sacred land, kind of thing. But I think far more of these things are spiritual, even though, and this is really important, and our tradition teaches it as well, that a spiritual entity may assume corporeal form for short periods of time.
You're letting Eamon now, you're opening the door to metaphysical Bigfoot now for Eamon. He's delighted with himself.
Me and Rob are constantly absolutely. I've had, I don't know what you'd say, like a feeling, I suppose, since, and I don't know when it started, but I always had this feeling like we're constantly surrounded by huge amounts of things. We just can't see them, but I always had. So when
Yeats had that thing of being surrounded by I'll get the quote wrong now, but it's like being surrounded by creatures patiently waiting for our senses to grow sharper.
That could be an angle. So before we go, Brother Richard, we could literally talk all night, and I'm not saying that to try and flatter you, but I'd say we'd be here all night. But we've got a couple of quick fire questions. Eamon did these.
Sure.
And this is from him, and he says, You have wonderful poems on your blog.
Yes.
I particularly enjoyed Stair Flights, especially the ending about not getting you started on doors. And Eamon wants to know, is there any writers or poets you're particularly fond of?
My favorite would be, well, there's 2 or 3. So Mary Oliver, number 1. I think her take on the natural world is extraordinary. And there is a book to be written out there on the supernatural life of Mary Oliver, because she hints numerous times, if you know where to look for it, in her poetry, of experiences out in the woods that, as she puts it, you wouldn't believe me if I told you.
Oh, cool.
That's the first thing. The second person I would go for hugely was Gerald Manley Hopkins. The kind of wonderfully alliterative writer, and one who just brought the beauty inherent in nature, what he called the inscape, the divine light present in the natural things, out. And the third and final one I'll mention is a guy who most people don't know, and that's Robert Lax, L-A-X, who was an incredible writer. He only died in 1998. But he wrote these beautiful linear poems, and I often use the linear format as well. And his idea was that every word is a poem in and of itself by dint of the associations it sets off in your mind. So you can read a poem through as a narrative, or you can just simply sit with a word and see what associations arise.
Oh, that's beautiful, actually. Yeah.
That's cool. So we've got another one. I don't know whether you want to let the cat out with a bag, but we know that there's a nerdy streak that goes through the Hendricks family. Do you have some? What are some of your favorite nerd culture movies, books, or games?
Tolkien, number 1, and we're actually speaking on the anniversary of his death.
Is it the anniversary today? Okay,
today is the anniversary.
Fantastic. He's my favorite too. I'm a Tolkien.
And what's beautiful as from the nerd point of view and the monastic point of view meeting together is that he used to visit our monastery in Oxford regularly.
Oh wow, really?
I lived with one of the brothers who knew him well.
Oh, cool. That's very cool.
And good connections there.
Mm-hmm. He's so inspiring. Like he's I recently picked up The Hobbit again, and I was just reading the start of it, and it does stir something in you. And I think even I was lucky enough, my dad read them to me at a super young age,
beautiful.
The movies. I was probably 7 or 8, but he's able to instill something in you, and for some reason I think personally that it instilled like a love of the outdoors and stuff in me. Just that sense of adventure that he conveys is just, I think, unparalleled. He has that
lovely quote that in every battle I am on the side of the trees. And I think it's a beautiful thing. There's that with him. I mean, again, from a supernatural point of view, in his letters, he speaks of various kind of visionary experiences he had, and he always saw himself as not writing, but as being a recorder of a history that was being delivered to him.
That's right, yeah.
He's this lovely piece where somebody said to him, "Do you believe elves exist?" And his response was, "Well, I believe that I can't have an idea that wasn't already in the divine mind. So therefore, elves exist, if only as an idea of the divine mind."
Okay. Was he a religious man then, Tolkien?
Roman Catholic, and he's now up for canonization.
Oh, really? Really?
Yes, we could be speaking of Saint Tolkien in years to come.
hopefully, really.
Yeah.
I know I bought my dad, if you ever read the book of Christmas letters he used to make for his children.
Oh, for the children, they're extraordinary,
they're beautiful. Yeah.
He's fantastic. So, any movies? If you got a Brother Richard movie pick, if you were to have one, Tolkien is definitely one writer you could probably read for the rest of your life. Is there a movie that you could watch?
It would have to be The Name of the Rose, wouldn't it?
I don't think I've seen that.
Oh my goodness! Okay, you're missing a joy. So imagine a medieval monastery with Sean Connery playing a Franciscan who is a detective and one of the first scientists.
Oh wow, that sounds pretty good.
Okay, yeah,
go for it.
We need to check this
Go for it and enjoy it.
Yeah, that definitely sounds good. So what we'll do, Brother Richard, is before we go, we'd like to ask you: have you got anything that you'd like to plug? Anything that you'd like to raise awareness on? Is there anything you'd like to say before we get out of here?
I suppose just to thank you for having me on. I will plug a book. There's a new book coming out which is called Calming the Storms, and it's a guide with regard to meditation.
Very
and
good.
That's coming out on the 12th of September.
Oh, really? That's soon. Okay, great.
Yeah. So it'll be around. And apart from that, apart from listening to your good selves, go and listen to Strange Familiars and Where Did the Road Go, and have your mind blown. I think that's the most important thing for everybody.
Yeah, and I think Tim does a great job as well at raising awareness of the Capuchins. So I would also say that if anyone has a few bob to spare, or maybe even if they were considering supporting us, to head on over to the Capuchin Society, isn't it? And there is a website, right?
Yeah, if you go to Capuchins, just Irish Capuchins, you'll find all of the details there about the various works that we do. We don't solicit funding, but if people do want to contribute towards the work, we're always very grateful naturally to receive it. I can assure people that their funding goes to the work. And also just to say, the most important thing for us is that people are compassionate to the people they meet along the way. So if you're local and don't want to be necessarily contributing to something that's up in Dublin, there are plenty of people around you who could do with the help and assistance. So
that's a great way of putting
it. Your local group and do it that way.
And I will say to any of our international listeners that maybe aren't aware of the Capuchins' work up in Dublin, especially, like, they're fantastic, well known for doing great work. Thanks a million for coming on, Brother Richard. It was amazing, and like I said, we'll definitely be having you on soon for another chat.
Sure, I'd be happy anytime, lads. No problem at all.
Thanks very much.